much. Thank you. Well, I'm Argyro Kanaki. I'm a lecturer in the School of Education and Social Work. My background is applied linguistics. And my main thing that I do is I train teachers. And I train teachers how to teach languages. This is the main thing that I'm doing. As I said, my background is applied linguistics, and in the last 30 years, a lot of things have happened in this very, very big field of applied linguistics. A lot of things have happened in social linguistics, in psycholinguistics, in educational linguistics from the teaching and learning perspective. But unfortunately, the new research findings or the new conceptualizations haven't been transferred into our teaching and learning procedures, either in schools, at universities, or even if we want to talk about language policies on a national level. There are still quite a lot of myths, and this is the reason why I'm going to start my presentation by explaining some of these myths about bilingualism and why these myths exist. This is the first thing. The second thing that I'm going to talk is about the new definition of language. In linguistics, we're not talking anymore, in applied linguistics to be more specific, we're not talking anymore about language. We give a totally new definition. And at the end, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some plurilingual approaches, what we can do in education in order to embrace multilingualism. Okay. Now, for this presentation, although I'm talking about bilingualism, but the term means somebody who has two languages, I also talk about people who have more than two languages. Okay. So let's start, first of all, with the myths, because we have got quite a lot of myths, and a lot of people who are professionals believe in these myths. I'm using François Grosjean, his very, very interesting book, Bilingual Life and Reality, from 2010. François is a Swiss francophone, but also bilingual himself between French and English. And he devoted all his research work to describe who is a bilingual person, or what are the skills that bilingual people have. And I'm going to present you here some of these myths. The first myth is that bilingualism is a rare phenomenon. This is absolutely wrong. It has been estimated that more than 70% of the global population are bilingual or multilingual. That means people have more than one language. So the notion that people have one language, or even the notion of one language, one nation, that existed quite a lot in political sciences and other fields, that is not true, because the opposite happens. People are multilingual. The second thing, that there is a very, very big myth, is who is bilingual? Because people believe that bilinguals acquire their two or more languages in childhood. And this, again, is wrong, because nowadays the concept of bilingual is much, much wider. Bilingual people are not only the children who grow up using two or more languages. We're talking about early bilingualism, or we're talking about late bilingualism. For example, people who learn languages when they go to the secondary school or when they go to the primary school, they are considered to be bilingual. Of course, this is the late bilingualism, not early bilingualism, but still, they're considered to be bilingual. Or people who decide to move countries because of work, for example, immigrants, they are considered to be bilingual. So the notion that bilinguals acquire the 2 or more languages in childhood does not exist, does not apply anymore. We are all bilinguals, and if we put it right, we are all multilinguals. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, especially when I'm going to give you the new conceptualization of what language is. Definitely, we can all be considered to be multilingual, not monolingual. Another big myth, a very, very big myth, is that bilingual people have equal and perfect knowledge of the languages. That is not true. Some people have equal mastery of 2 or more languages, but the majority of people have very big differentiation. For example, they might have academic language in the L1, the first language, and they might have, for example, another competence in the second language. So, for example, not academic use of French or German, but they have enough competencies to go to France to buy things or to talk to people. But they might not be able, for example, to solve a mathematical problem in French. So that is, they're still bilingual, but they don't have the perfect mastery of 2 languages. For example, take children, immigrant children. They speak 2 languages, a language at home, a language at school. They might not develop academic language at their L1, but they will develop academic language in L2 because they go to the school on the second country. So the notion that you have to speak perfectly and fluently all the languages that you have is not true. The other important thing is you develop competencies and skills when there is a need. In other words, you might have heard that, oh, I did quite a lot of French at the school, but I have forgotten them. A lot of people say that, or have done German, and I have forgotten it. It's because they haven't used it. Because there is there is a golden rule here that if you don't speak it, you lose it. If there is no need, you're not going to have the language in a perfect mastery. There is another thing as well. Somebody might be a passive bilingual. What does that mean? That means that might not be able to speak, okay, but might be able to understand. So people have different levels, language levels in the languages that they've got. Another interesting thing is that real bilinguals have no accent in the different languages. And again, the accent is a very, very strange thing and very complicated because children develop accents in their childhood when they learn the languages. After, it's much more difficult to develop the right accent in the language. So some children might not develop their right and the appropriate accent in the languages that they speak. And again, they're considered to be bilingual. The other interesting thing that you might hear people saying is about translation. If you're bilingual, you can do translations immediately. You can say, oh, how do you say that in the other language? That is not absolutely true. Because, yes, people might be able to say, all right, how I'm going to say chair in English and how I'm going to say chair in French and stuff like that. But to do translations is a totally different thing. You must be trained to do translations, okay? Or you must have the academic, the jargon in the other language so that you can do translations. So not everybody is born as translator. You can speak a lot of different languages, but you might not be able to do translations. These are 2 different things. Another interesting thing, and unfortunately this myth exists quite a lot in schools. and a lot of teachers complain about that, is that mixing languages is a sign of laziness in bilinguals. And a lot of teachers expect that the pupils need to speak only, for example, English, and they shouldn't mix up the languages. And this is, it's unfortunate because mixing languages is a very, very natural phenomenon, extremely natural phenomenon. Pupils and people in general distinguish between the languages in a later stage. But when you're small and when you learn the languages, you mix up, because sometimes the word does not come very, very quickly in your head on the first language or in the second language, and comes on the other language. It's a very, very natural phenomenon that should be tolerated, not the other way around. It's not a sign of laziness either, because especially the children, as they grow up, they distinguish the social context and the people who they have to speak to a specific language. So, for example, if a grandparent only speaks English, the child understands that in that social context, with that particular person, I have to speak only English. But that comes with the time, and it's not a sign of laziness. Another big myth is about culture, that bilinguals are also bicultural. And that is not absolutely true. I mean, if bilingual people come into contact with the countries where the languages are spoken, and they visit grandparents, they live a little bit, and they come into contact, yes, they can grow, they can develop as bicultural, not only bilingual people. But that is not necessarily true, because if, for example, somebody stays only in one country, doesn't visit the other country, doesn't come into contact with the other country, that might mean that, yes, the person is bilingual, but is not bicultural. These things happen the other way around. For example, we've got quite a lot of British people who live in the United States. These people, because they can come by, they can deal with the cultural topics in both countries, Britain and United States, that makes them immediately to be bicultural. Although, as a matter of language, they only use English, and they're not bilingual. So culture is not necessarily, doesn't go together with language all the time. Another interesting thing is that bilinguals have double or split personalities, because the fact that they switch off from one language to another language, they can transfer things from one language, what they say, to the other language. People believe that they have some charisma or special skills or split personalities, but none of these things are true. Another interesting thing in myth is about emotions. That bilinguals express their emotions in their first language. This is not true. And there is a lot of research done by De Wael, who is a Belgian scholar, works in a university in London, about feelings and about emotions. The research has shown that it's a very, very complicated thing. It's not an easy thing. The fact that you speak one language or two languages, that does not mean that you can express your feelings. People, individuals, choose according to their preferences what language they're going to use to express their feelings. Another interesting thing, for example, you see people who are bilingual, immigrants, for example, who work and stuff like that in a specific country. Here, for example, sometimes when they want to swear or something doesn't go properly and they get frustrated, sometimes the first word that comes out is the F word in English, not in Polish, not in Romanian or whatever language they have as an L1, but comes in English. So we don't know a lot of things, about emotions and language and why they choose a specific language. It's more about individual preferences there. Another big myth, and unfortunately this myth exists nowadays and exists in Scottish schools quite a lot, is the next one, that bilinguals will delay language acquisition in children. Teachers and headmasters believe that, unfortunately, but also parents also believe that. So we see, for example, on one hand, teachers in schools who say, oh, for example, immigrant children should only speak English and only English because they have to develop their English skills. And sometimes pupils are not allowed to use their L1, Polish or whatever, because there is this myth, because there is this mentality. We see as well this mentality on the other spectrum, for example, from parents, that I'm going to talk a little bit in the next one. But that is not true. Speaking different languages, or more than one language, is a positive thing. One language supports the other language. There is a lot of research. Main person, for example, Bialystok, a lot of research from Canada, where they've got English and French, who did quite a lot about bilingual, a lot of research about bilingual people and bilingual children and the cognitive benefits of bilingualism. So this is not true. And this is, I think, personally, I think this is something that we have to notice very, very carefully, because we've got quite a lot of language policies that have that in the language policies, that we have to promote the first language, and the first language here is English. As I said, there is the next thing as well, that a lot of parents believe that if they speak their L1 at home, that has a negative impact on the language acquisition, and especially on the school language development of English. And that's why a lot of parents take the decision to speak only English at home rather than their L1. And this is another myth, a very, very big myth, because, as I said, one language supports and helps the second language, and the other way around. And we should, as a state, teachers, university, we should promote minorities' languages, and especially parents to speak the home language, their L1, at home is extremely, extremely important. This is still happening because there are language ideologies. People have attribute specific values on languages. And especially immigrants who think, for example, oh, we live in another country, we have to try hard, to work hard, we have to show that we speak English. They put this very big value, attribute the value to English, and they push English, trying to suppress their L1. And the last myth. Okay. That's it, I think, yeah. And the last thing is that the children who are raised bilingual will always mix up their languages. That it's a common phenomenon, that they're going to mix up all the time the languages, and they cannot develop properly their L2, which is again another myth. Because as the children grow up, they can distinguish the social context and the people who they are talking to, and they can distinguish who is going to speak their L1 and to whom they're going to speak their L2. So there are a lot of myths about languages, and of course these myths also create ideologies that we are going to see in a minute. Let's say now, The new definition of language, because as I said, the research from sociolinguistics, educational linguistics, psycholinguistics have brought quite a lot of things into the field, but these things haven't been transferred into our education. However, they put into question some very, very foundational notions about language. The first thing is about there is a standard, there is a national language. But I'm going to challenge that and question it. What is a standard language? What is a national language? Here, for example, I mean, I don't know, because there are quite a lot of unknown faces here. You might be Scottish, you might be Northern Irish, you might be English, you might be from South Africa, you might be Australian. All of you, you speak English, but you speak English in a totally different way. So what is the standard national language? Another thing is the monolingual native speaker as the yardstick. And this still continues. That's why we've got quite a lot of language tests and examinations. But all these language test examinations assess pupils according to the native speaker yardstick. I'm questioning that. Let's say that you are all English native speakers. You all have totally different number of vocabulary. You don't know the same vocabulary or the same jargon in English. Some of you might write fluently English. Some others you might do quite a lot of mistakes or spelling mistakes. You're, let's say, native speakers, you have different accents. So where is the yardstick? How can we assess our pupils and our students in the English or French or German if we have as a yardstick the native speaker? Because who is the perfect speaker? Who is the perfect native speaker? When there is so much differentiation. The other thing is, again, the monocultural thing. And again, that is the idea of one nation, one language, and of course one culture. And nowadays, I mean, you can hear, there are plenty of news, and of course things, what happens in America with Trump, Brexit, stuff like that. There are a lot of things that push these ideas about one culture, one language, one nation. The other thing is that the L2 learner is always a deficient, the inadequate speaker. That if somebody speaks English as an L2, will always make the mistakes, will always must be penalized for that. And we see what happens with our international students, for example. How can we assess them? Are they always deficient? In what sense? Now, the next thing is about the interlanguage between the L1 system and the L2 system. In the past, languages were looked at as totally separate entities. That one language that is not transferred, does not get confused, mixed up, does not transfer abilities from one language to another language, is they're totally separate entities in somebody's head. Again, this is very, very, that has been questioned and challenged quite a lot. And the last thing, and especially about teaching and learning of languages, the main pedagogy for the last 20 years was the communicative competence. That communication is very important. We don't focus on grammar, we don't focus a lot on vocabulary, it's the communication. The communication is the most important thing. Again, that has been challenged and questioned a lot, especially about the meaning-making practices, when people speak languages, about language awareness, a grammatical awareness, play quite a big role. So what is language nowadays? After almost 30 years with so much research and so much academic work in the different areas of applied linguistics. So what is language? Right, language is considered as a repertoire. And it is a repertoire that doesn't look the languages separately, but we look languages as one thing, as a very, very big entity. And this entity is very, very dynamic. And it never finishes. It never completes. According to Pudi and Luke, who say that we always develop language, even our mother tongue. From the time that we are born till we start learning the language, till the time we die. Throughout our lifetime, we develop languages and our language. So it's a very, very dynamic, dynamic entity. And Bush, I'm going to give you a quote from Bush because I really think that this applies. We are all multilinguals and we negotiate continuously our multiple resources to make sense of the world around us and to communicate effectively with others. So it's very important. It's now a repertoire. So what does this repertoire embrace? Does it embrace only language like English, French, German, Arabic? What? Let's see. Now, this repertoire embraces everything that deals with language. Embraces accents, language varieties. So somebody from Aberdeen has a totally different language variety from somebody from Glasgow, for example. Or accents, registers, genres, modalities, such, for example, writing or speaking, ways of using language in particularly communicative settings. The way that we speak to our colleagues is totally different from the way that we speak at home. It's different language. Spheres of life, including the ideas people have about such ways of using the language ideology. Not only it's the accent, the genres, everything that deals with language, but also is our beliefs, our values that we attribute to languages as well. So, for example, imagine yourselves, for example, if you have children, and they learn languages at school. They might learn, for example, I don't know, Gaelic, Scots, French, German. Imagine that one day come to home and they say to you, I'm going to start learning Albanian. What might you think then? You will say, go for it. When I do this question with my students say to me, Albanian? For what reason? And for what reason is not because the reason that they put is that they're not going to use Albanian afterwards in their lives, it's not good for work prospects and stuff like that. It's not so much that, it's the value and the ideology that we have about what Albanian language is, or Albania as a country or people. So all these things are part of the repertoire that we've got. It's not a language, it's a repertoire now. And I think it's a very, very big thing, because if we change the concept, we do things in a total different way. Presumably at the university level, schools, language policies. This is another interesting area, especially when you start to deconstruct language policies. Here in Scotland, we've got 1+2 language policy, for example, which is a very, very interesting policy. And if you start deconstructing a little bit, there are a lot of things that are hidden there. So a new definition, a new conceptualization of language. So what can we do? How we can embrace a multilingual perspective in in the educational system, because my background and what I'm doing here is a teaching and learning of modern foreign languages. I'm about to submit my PhD, which is about metalinguistic awareness, but again, from a teaching and learning perspective. What I'm interested is, again, I can take different things from sociolinguistics, psycholinguistics, stuff like that, but what I'm really interested in is how we can use these things in the teaching and learning aspect, okay? So how can we embrace this multilingual perspective? Because things change all the time. The first thing is that we need to change the view of languages in education. And presumably we have to adopt a holistic view of languages in a way that is not anymore language, but is about linguistic repertoire. Because if we use language in the way that we used it before, it gives us quite a lot of problems. And one of the problems, for example, is that how we can include our EAL students, EAL pupils, pupils who do not speak English as a first language. So we have to adopt a new concept, a new view, which is a linguistic repertoire. We have to accept the partial competence on languages. As we said, we cannot have the perfect mastery on all the languages that we've got, on all the linguistic skills that we learn. The other interesting thing is that bilingual plurilingualism are normal and achievable by all. This is very, very interesting because there is this myth again in schools, like for example with the mathematics, languages are difficult. I cannot do languages. You hear pupils who say, I don't like French, I cannot do it. And it's because that there is this myth like mathematics. They're difficult. They're very, very difficult. They have heard this thing from somebody else, and the pupils continue this mentality, continue this idea, although plurilingualism and bilingualism is a normal, and it can be achieved by all. Another myth that you might hear, for example, is, dyslexic pupils cannot learn languages. And we've got plenty of research, very good textbooks, for example, from Kormos, who talks about dyslexia and learning languages. The next thing is about, we need to stress the importance of the cognitive benefits of plurilingual education. Again, Bialystok, a lot of research regarding the cognitive, regarding about the development of problem-solving skills, or this intellectual flexibility that languages and the use of different languages can give us. Nowadays is important as well the social integration about plurilingual approaches that contribute to social integration. And because when we learn languages, it's not only we learn a language, and when we discuss about languages, it's not just an educational thing we just discuss, it's a discussion. No, we contribute to the development of respect, openness towards the other. Who is the other? And of course, it's an empowerment. It's an empowerment for all learners because it contributes to social justice. It is a human right. Speaking languages is a human right. And I want to remind you that we live in a country where the 2010 Equality Act, the Equality Act of 2010, protects different characteristics, but it doesn't protect language. Although Britain has minority languages, has Gaelic, has Scots if you want, has Welsh, if you want to put, has Cornish, has a lot of minority languages, plus immigrant languages, a lot of people who moved to Britain. Nevertheless, the Equality Act protects a lot of different characteristics, but doesn't protect language, and it doesn't refer to language at all. If we want to be more specific about didactic approaches, we can see some didactic approaches in different parts of the world, mainly in Europe, in Australia, in Canada, and in the United States. These didactic approaches that have been used so far is integrated didactics. When we call, what we call integrated didactics is when we, for example, take into consideration all the possible languages that exist in our classroom. We take into consideration all the languages and we speak about the languages, the differences, the similarities in a very, very explicit way. Another didactic approach is the awakening to languages, which is a movement that started in Britain in the 90s. And this is addressed to very, very young learners. And this is about language awareness, trying to make young pupils to be aware of the diversity of languages and what diversity of languages means. Another interesting didactic approach is the intercomprehension between related languages. According to that is that you learn languages and you work on languages that are interrelated and interconnected because they belong to the same linguistic family. So, for example, you see schools that do work, for example, on Romance languages. So, for example, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, because all these languages are interrelated, and the pupils learn the other Romance languages. Or, for example, intercomprehension between related languages is a lot that happens in Scandinavia, where pupils, for example, do work, for example, in Danish, and then they can transfer it to Swedish, because they can understand and they do the work because they are interrelated and they can understand. The other interesting thing is the content and language integrated learning that is very, very popular in Europe. Of course, it has some negative aspects as well, and there is a lot of research done on the positive and negative aspects. What is the content and language integrated learning is that, for example, when you teach sciences using French, using the medium of another language, so using French or using German, although you might be in Scotland or Britain. So far, there are didactic approaches that look the multilingualism. And there are now new tendencies as well to embrace migrant languages, for example, Arabic. And there are a lot of movements there, especially in Germany, when they're trying to include immigrant languages within the curriculum. My main aim of this presentation is to undermine the ancient prejudices, make people aware of the new conceptualization of language, of what language is, and how language can we use in education. There is a lot of linguistic parochialism, and there are a lot of myths that still exist nowadays. And one of the things that I'm trying to do all the time, make people aware that language is a totally different thing, is a repertoire, and we have to be multilingual because we have the seeds inside us to be multilingual. It's just a change and a shift of our mindset. Thank you very much, and if you have any questions, please let me know.